there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Welcome back to the TEFLology podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. Today we are delighted to bring you an interview with Professor Jennifer Jenkins. The interview was conducted at the University of Southampton in the south of England, where Jennifer is the Chair of Global Englishes and the Director of the Centre for Global Englishes. Jennifer's main research interest is Global Englishes, and in particular, English as a Lingua Franca. More recently, Jennifer has studied English language policies in higher education and the implications of the spread of English and use of ELF for international and home students in both British universities and English medium universities in Europe and East Asia. Jennifer has written a number of notable publications about the aforementioned subjects, including 2000's The Phonology of English as an International Language, New Models, New Norms, New Goals, 2007's English as a Lingua Franca, Attitude and Identity, and 2015's Global English, a resource book for students. In the interview, I asked Jennifer questions about the development of ELF research, its perceptions in the wider field, and some research that Professor Jenkins is currently conducting. Enjoy the interview. Okay, so I'm sitting here with Professor Jennifer Jenkins at the University of Southampton, and thank you very much for agreeing to speak to me today. So I'd like to begin by asking, could you tell our listeners about the journey you took to becoming interested in English as a lingua franca, and what this research field is all about?
Well, when I first became interested in it, it wasn't a research field at all. It didn't exist. The name itself didn't exist, but it was in the 1980s. I was an EFL teacher in a language school in London, and I used to teach people from many different languages, first languages, in the classroom. And gradually I noticed that although I was teaching them sort of standard English, whatever that is, I mean, the sort of the rules of what we call standard English, native-like English. And they learnt them. Most of them were good. They were good learners. They learnt them and they did their exams. All the sort of Cambridge exams were the ones that were done in the school I taught in. So first certificate and proficiency were the only ones at that time, and then later others were added. And they passed them and they got good grades. But when they were left to speak among themselves, without the exam element or a teacher element, they didn't use the English I was teaching them. They did all sorts of other things. So, I would have taught them about countable and uncountable nouns, but they would speak to each other and say things like informations and advices. Or I would teach them the difference between the present simple, the past simple and the present perfect.
Right.
And I've almost forgotten the rules myself now, that with the simple past, you have to have a time reference. So I went somewhere last weekend, but I've been somewhere without a time reference. I think I've got that right, I hope so. But you would hear them say something like, "Where have you been at the weekend?" Or "I've been to Paris last weekend." And they didn't use those rules. But of course, what I noticed was that they had no problems understanding each other. They really did seem to understand each other very, very well. If there were any problems, they were normally related to pronunciation, because that was where they had their biggest differences. And they very quickly sorted them out. If somebody thought that somebody hadn't understood them, they would have another go. I later learned that was called accommodation, but it means just they adjusted the way they spoke. And gradually they started to laugh at each other. They thought it was funny that each other were using these sort of maybe French influences. So I always remember in one conversation when a French student said, when I've finished studying English, I'm going to go into the law, and they all laughed because they knew she meant law, but with her French accent she said low.
I see.
And it, but gradually they got used to it. So familiarity seemed to be very important, but also they were adjusting. And because I had a background in linguistics, I was very aware of the language use itself, and got very interested in what they were doing, and started to think, why are we teaching them this native-like English? They're not using it when they speak to each other, and especially if we went down to the cafe or to the pub or something like that, or out for lunch. At the end of each course we would go for lunch, and they weren't using these rules that I'd been teaching them. And I started to think, what is the point?
Yeah.
And it was because of that I decided to research this, to find out what it was they were doing, why they were doing it, and what they were doing when they had problems. So that's how I got into it. That was a very long-winded explanation of how I got into it.
And going back to that time in the 1980s, in terms of research, what was available, or what were the scholars telling us at the time about?
Very little. What happened was I decided that to do the research properly, I needed to have access to a university. So I decided to do a PhD.
Right.
So I went off to London University to do a PhD, and started working on it and started looking for what I could read. And when I looked at the literature on English language teaching, or EFL as it was called then, English as a Foreign Language, it was all about how to, it was all about second language acquisition, how people develop their ability to use native-like English. Mostly it was English that was used, even though it was supposedly about all languages, but English was always the example. And then how to teach this in the classroom. There was nothing about what I was interested in. Then, because my first supervisor was at the time editing what I think is probably the first handbook of World English. I can't remember exactly. I think it was called English Around the World or something like that. But it was the very first book of that kind. I think it was published in 1991. Right. And when I first went to her a couple of years earlier, 3 years earlier, she was working on it. So she introduced me to the World English's literature. So I got very interested in that and read a lot of it. That was a new subject at the time. It was, it started only about 10 years earlier with the very famous scholar, the late Braj Khatru, who had a conference on World Englishes at his university in the US, Illinois, and produced a book of the conference. And basically, the ideology was very much the ideology I was developing, which is it's just a myth to say that because something isn't like native English, there's something wrong with it. That and a myth that people learn English to communicate with native English speakers, because that was not my experience. They were all going to go off and work for international institutions like banks or whatever, universities, but they weren't going to be working with native English speakers mainly. And World Englishes was much more about the Englishes in post-colonial countries, so say English in India, English in Singapore, English in Nigeria, and so on, and how people used English in their own ways, talking to each other, but not to native English speakers. Though, of course, these people in countries like that generally were multilingual, 3 or 4 languages. English was just one of them, and they used English with each other for certain things, but they used English in their own way. And I was very influenced by this literature, so that was what I found first, as well as my first supervisor then left to go and work in Switzerland, so my second supervisor was a social psychologist, and he introduced me to accommodation because we realised that what I was finding in my data was that people are changing the way they're adjusting to make their English easier for each other to understand.
Yeah.
So it was these two things initially. It was the world English literature and the social psychology literature on accommodation that started me off.
Right, okay. And just moving ahead to 2015, bit of a leap, but
big jump.
you co-authored an article with Will Baxter, who I think also works here.
Will Baker, yeah.
Will Baker, sorry, my mistake. And you mentioned that ELF has often been the subject of uninformed and ad hominem criticism. And well, firstly, why do you think this criticism exists, and what are some of the arguments levelled at ELF research?
Okay, I'll start with the first. Why did this criticism exist? Language is a very emotive subject for everybody. People get very exercised by language, whether they are language professionals, language researchers, or just general, language users, as everybody is. And so language is already rather emotive, or emotional even. Language change is worse, because anybody suggesting that language change is okay, people are very fixated on the language as it is now, or as they think it should be now. So there's already a resistance to the anything that changes, and especially because language change often happens from what Peter Trudgill once called language change from below. It's working class change, and in the case of the sort of thing I talk about, it's non-native speakers changing the language. So of course you can imagine that native speakers of English don't like that, but also other non-native speakers don't like that. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is that people simply didn't understand what we were saying.
Right.
So people thought we were saying things like, well, it's not just that they didn't understand. The research changed as time went on. As we discovered more things, we changed our argument. So originally, as I've said, we were talking about world Englishes as a big influence. Well, world English is about varieties. It's about varieties of English. And originally we thought we could talk about varieties of ELF. Very quickly we realised that didn't work. ELF is about language, English language that goes across boundaries. It transcends them. It doesn't sit within them. So when ELF is how communicate. If communication is happening through ELF, we're looking at communication across boundaries. So you can't say there is any variety there, because it's not. It simply doesn't work. So very early on, we stopped talking about varieties and made it very clear that we weren't. But some people didn't bother to read anything else we'd written since about 2002 and carried on. Another thing was that early in ELF research, we talked about restricting the number of native English speakers in the data collection so that they wouldn't influence, because it was found that if you have a lot of native speakers in a group, the non-native speakers of English are likely to be influenced by them and hyper-correct their English. So some people, for example, the voice corpus of Barbara Seidelhofer, they restricted it, I think, to 10% of native English speakers in the data. But they never said ELF does not include native English speakers, just for the data. But people then started to produce this myth that ELF excludes native speakers, and it didn't matter how many times we said that this is not true. They carried on saying it. And I think sometimes people are quite unscholarly, so somebody writes something and gets it wrong, and then somebody else reads what that person's written, and without looking at the source, say something I had written, Jenkins 2006 for example, they just say Jenkins 2006 said this, but they didn't read what I said. So they're reporting a mistake. And I think there's been a lot of this. There's been a lot of resistance to ELF because it goes so against the whole sort of ethos of English language teaching that has existed for the last 50 years. This idea that of course everybody wants to sound like a native speaker, or if they should want to sound like a native speaker, without realising that the world has changed so much, that the native speakers are now such a tiny minority that most people are going to be in ELF communication with no native speakers present.
Mm.
It's still ELF if there are native speakers present, but it's unlikely that they will be, or if there are, there might just be one or two. But most of the users of ELF are multilingual, which means that they have another language as well as English, whereas quite a lot of the small minority of native English speakers have only English.
Yeah, I see, yeah. And we'll come back to that word multilingual later, because I've got some questions about that.
Okay, there was a second part to this question.
There was, yeah. Shall I read it again?
Yes.
So what are some of the arguments that have been levelled at ELF research?
Well, I think I've covered them,
Yeah,
really, because,
yes,
arguments against language change, arguments... I mean, funnily enough, we've had arguments both from the World Englishes people and from the ELT profession. So the World Englishes people have talked about ELF trying to get some monolithic type of English to replace native. Well, that was never part of it. That was sheer misunderstanding.
Okay.
On the ELT side, they've accused us of trying to promote an anything goes. So on the one hand, we were accused of monolith, the other side of anything goes. And I mean, I would say that the fact that we have these two opposite contradictory arguments means that they're both wrong.
Right, yeah. And when I was studying my MA, the first that I heard of your work was the Lingua Franca core. And again, something you were saying, like this kind of word of mouth, this kind of trickling down of information. And I think I remember somebody saying to me, what Jenkins is saying is that this will be the new variety of English in the world, and this is what everyone's going to be speaking, and that's not what it's about.
No, the Lingua Franca core was simply, and I could only speak about the data that I'd collected. I collected a lot of data. I spent years collecting it, and what I did was look at two things. One, as what seemed to cause miscommunication, and quite often I asked the people, so they told me what they hadn't understood. And the second was to try and observe what they did if they thought someone hadn't understood, how they accommodated. And I then suggested that only this certain number of things need to be people to have them in their repertoire, so that their phonological, phonetic repertoire, so that they can use them when they need them. And everything else they don't need. If they want to learn everything else that natives do, learn it. I mean, I wasn't going to say don't. If they want to learn the features of connected speech, elision, ellipsis and all that, well, learn it. But you won't find that it helps your communication in ELF. It was never a variety. It was never even a model. It was just a core that I was suggesting people had. And then for the rest, do what you like. And everything else that was native pronunciation, I called non-core. But, if you want it, learn it. The other thing was, I never said that it was about anything except pronunciation. But, many times you'll read Barbara Seidelhofer has argued about the Lingua Franca core is also about lexis and grammar. It was never, ever about lexis and grammar.
Okay.
I mean, when I produced the Lingua Franca core from my research, it was the first publication was my PhD thesis in 1995, and Barbara Seidelhofer wasn't even working in ELF at the time. She didn't start until 5-6 years later, and it was never about lexis, and yet this idea persists that it was about everything, and that it was a variety. I mean, the Lingua Franca core itself was never about a variety.
What's the current state of the Lingua Franca core? Is it still being adapted or added to? Or
I get emails about it all the time. I had one yesterday. Someone's just read the 2000 book, the phonology, which I then called English as an International Language, because nobody knew what ELF was and thought it was a funny name. But and just wrote yesterday to say they'd read it and it's wonderful. Well, I mean, I still support the Lingua Franca core to some extent. I think the details are not all absolutely right, because one person collecting data can't get everything right and say everything there is. But other people who have replicated it have not found a lot of difference. But the main thing part of that work, and the main part of my PhD, was about accommodation. It was what people do to adjust when people don't understand them. And I absolutely stand by that. And the whole concept of looking at, what it is that people need to be familiar with in intercultural communication, what they need to train their ears so that they can understand, and what people need to be able to do to learn to adjust, and maybe which sort of features of their own pronunciation other people might find difficult to understand. And, those are the sorts of things that I think could be taught. I mean, I don't normally talk much about teaching, but I think those sorts of things would be very valuable to learners of English who are going to use it for intercultural communication, i.e. for ELF.
I heard you in another podcast interview. You talked about ELF aware teaching, and that could apply to both learners and the teachers, I guess. Yeah,
ELF aware teacher training and ELF aware teaching. Right. I mean, or ELF effective teaching.
Right.
And ELF aware. I mean, they're very similar, but I do feel, and I think it is starting to happen actually, because I think teachers are starting to be trained as part of teacher training. I think people are now hearing about ELF. I don't know how much and how, whether the training is actually getting it right, or whether it's teaching people, things that aren't true about ELF.
Right.
But at least I think it is actually coming in now into teacher training courses. So I mean, it's not, you can't teach people like you taught EFL that use this grammar, use this vocabulary, use these sounds. It's more about being aware of how English is used when it's in intercultural communication. Not in with native speakers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. In a recent paper, 2015 again, you call for the re-theorization. Is that correct?
Yeah.
of ELF. And you talked about the two phases that there's been. For example, I think one was ELF started out as being more focused on the form, and that kind of moved more into a phase that recognised the social practice of ELF. So I'm wondering, could you kind of tell us the characteristics of these two phases, or these changes from one phase to another?
Well, what the first phase was pretty much what I talked about when I was talking about World Englishes and the influence of that. We were focusing on forms with the aim of trying to identify varieties of ELF that could be then codified. Okay. So what was found was that there's certain things that, regardless of your first language, everybody seems to do, like using what native speakers would use as uncountable nouns, turning them into countable ones, which of course is a process that's been happening in the native language over the centuries too, but it's only allowed when the native speakers do it. You're not allowed to do it if you're not a native speaker. You have to wait for us to do it first. So things like that, but the not using the third person S in the present simple tense, which of course is the only ending that's still left. I mean, I had to learn Old English as part of my English language and literature degree many years ago, and in Old English, all six parts had first, second, third person singular and plural all had an ending, different ending. We only nowadays have the S on the third person singular, and there's no point in that S. It doesn't do anything because there's always a pronoun in front of it to tell you that it's third person singular. It's always he, she, or it. So you don't need it, but it's still used, though it is being dropped. It's been dropped for a long time. In working class and certain regional dialects. So certain social and regional dialects, but it's still taught and has to be there. But what you find in ELF data is a lot of people don't use it. Sometimes they do, but often they don't. But so that was the first phase. That was ELF, what I've called. I only called it ELF 1 in order to distinguish between different phases of theory about it. But that was very much thinking about the forms. In similar ways to what World English's research had been doing and still does. And It didn't take very long. Once we had these two big corpora, the voice corpus in Vienna and the Alpha corpus, English as a lingua franca in academic settings, Anna Marinen's corpus in Helsinki, well, it was in Tampere, then in Helsinki. And once you started to look at all that data, it was clear you couldn't possibly, you could identify what people are doing, but it was so variable. And the different speakers involved, I mean, I think Anna Marinen had 93 different first languages in her corpus. Oh. Now, you can't possibly, because there's so many variables involved. And what became obvious about ELF was that the most, its most prevailing, prominent characteristic was that it's variable. Variability is its chief characteristic. You cannot look at forms and say, this is ELF, this is German ELF, or this is Japanese ELF, or whatever. It's just ELF. And what became interesting then is why people did what they did, and how they did it, and looking at it as a social practice and how people adjust. And accommodation became very, very important at this point. It had been there before, and it was certainly my first interest with the Lingua Franca core, was looking not at the core itself, but how people adjusted in and out of it.
I see.
But it became very, very important. And once you've got people using ELF as a social practice and you're studying it as a social practice, you're not looking at the forms anymore, but you're looking at the processes, what they're actually doing, why they accommodate at this point, why they change the way they've said this. And that basically, ELF was realised how fluid and flexible it was, how people were creating hybrid forms. So, you've got people from different first languages together, and they're actually creating new ways of using English. Right. It became very rich, and we realised it was very rich. And so that would be the second phase, where suddenly, not suddenly, it wasn't a sudden thing, but it may have seemed sudden to people who had got used to reading the earlier literature in the first few years of this millennium. And so that was how it moved from the first to the second phase.
Yeah. And you talked about variability. And something that interests me is the, or maybe the misconception that ELF communication is something that comes out of a shared repertoire, with communities of users being engaged in a shared practice. And you kind of hinted that this might not be the case. And
that's if we move on to what I've called ELF 3.
Let's do that.
I mean, basically, I started to feel probably about 5 years ago that ELF research was getting, it was looking in on itself a bit too much and getting a bit sort of repetitive. We're just doing more of the same. We've decided we know what it is and it's just being repeated. But actually, I felt that there's far too much focus on the English of ELF. And there needs to be much more focus on the lingua franca aspect of ELF. Because so many people use ELF who are not native English speakers. They are multilingual. The vast majority of ELF users, I wouldn't have put numbers on it, but I did read that there may be around 430 million Chinese users of English. Now, when you think that there's about half that native speakers of English in the world, and that's only the Chinese who are not native, and then you look at all the rest of the world who's using ELF, who's mostly not native, it's got to be used mainly among people who are not native speakers. They're not going to often speak with a native speaker of English. And it's their multilingualism that is very important. And I felt that this had been rather marginalised, and that we couldn't just think about ELF as having multilingualism as one of its characteristics. You often see people talk about ELF, and ELF has these various characteristics. And so, they'll put code switching in, for example. They'll put multilingualism, but usually it goes last, multilingualism. And actually, what people are doing is something very different from code switching. They are using other languages in their ELF communication, but it fits much better with the notion of translanguaging, which is where people, going back to what you said about the repertoire, they have one repertoire. Bilingualism research or critical bilingualism research has shown in the last 10, 20 years that people don't have lots of parallel monolingual languages if they have several languages. They don't store them all separately and just use each one like a native speaker. They have one repertoire that contains all their language, and they select strategically from that to use in any communication. So in an ELF communication, they may be using English, but they may go in and out of their multilingual repertoire and trans-language. And quite often you find in ELF communication that people are not even using English.
Right.
They all have it available. I gave this new definition, I'm not sure if I can remember the wording of it, but ELF 3 is multilingualism, in which English is available as a language of choice but may not be used.
That's right. Yeah.
So you
That's exactly what I've got written.
Oh, is that what I actually said? I never remember.
Yeah.
Which it contrasts with the notion of English as a contact language among people who do not share a first language, and it's often it's the language of choice and often the only one available. That seems to leave multilingualism out, the older definition.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm looking at the fact that you may get a group of Chinese people sitting around in a cafe, they all know English, but they are using Chinese. But they could slip back into English if they wanted to. If someone from Japan joined them, they'd slip into English. I don't know if you know of Richard Caldwell, who has a very interesting blog. And on his blog fairly recently, he heard about this article I've written about ELF 1, 2 and 3 and this repositioning of ELF and multilingualism. And he told on his blog this anecdote about when he was in Japan and how he was with people from lots of different languages. I know he mentioned Hungarian, but I can't remember which others. And he joined this group. They were all students together, but they hadn't met until the last day of a one-year course. They all met up on the last day. I think they'd all been scattered around Japan. They all met up, and they all had introductions. And they did this in English, and they all had perfectly usable English, and they spoke to each other in English. He was the only native speaker of English.
Right.
And then suddenly they all switched into Japanese.
Right.
And he says this would be a good example of ELF 3, of repositioning multilingualism as the framework, because they had English, but they'd been a year in Japan, and it was now their sort of language that they were more comfortable in. So they trans-languaged in and out of English and Japanese. I don't know if they used their own first languages as well at any point, because they weren't Japanese first language speakers. But I mean, this is on his blog. If you look up Richard Caldwell, it's a nice little story.
Right. Yeah. No, it describes it well. Yeah. Something else I found quite confusing is some of these other terms that exist. For example, Pennycook's metrolingualism and Kanagaraja's plurilingualism. How do they kind of tie in with? Because this is where I get confused.
I think they are confusing actually, because I think they're trying to talk about. They're trying to say there are no boundaries between languages, but then they do talk about boundaries between languages, and they talk about languages. So I find it confusing, but they are trying to find a way to talk about the fact that that languages, because of globalization and mobility and people moving around and lots of different language speakers, being all mixing up together, the boundaries between languages are becoming fuzzy, and it fits in with the more recent research on bilingualism and multilingualism, the critical bilingualism, the multilingual turn, where you're not looking at people who have 3 languages and each one is like the monolingual speaker of that language, that those languages influence each other.
Right.
And therefore the way they're using those languages is not the way a monolingual speaker of that language would use it.
I see.
And so, I mean, there are all these different terms that people are using. It is incredibly confusing. And I think they're all saying very much the same thing. I don't think there's a vast amount of difference, and they all seem to agree with each other.
Right, yeah.
But I don't think that it would be easy to distinguish. You know, looking at the different things that people use, and Penny Cook's talked about multilingua franca, translingua franca. Suresh Kanagaraja talks about plurilingualism, but also multilingualism and lingua franca English, and you know they all have different terms for things. Which I find confusing myself.
Okay, it's not just me. Okay. Just one final, or a couple more questions. Maybe one setting where maybe multilingualism would come into play is on a university campus where we are today, and you've recently, or you're coming to the end of a 3-year project on language diversity on international campuses. Could you briefly describe some of the findings that have come out of this project?
Well, at the moment, the findings, I mean, we've got 10 universities, 2 in native English-speaking countries, which is the UK and Australia, Monash in Australia, Southampton in the UK. The others are all in Europe, Turkey, which I'm not quite sure whether you count Europe or sort of Middle East, but it is Boazici, which is, I think, probably would count itself as European.
Okay.
And then we've got East Asia, we've got China, we've got Japan, and Malaysia. At the moment, we've only got 3 chapters, three lots of reports coming in. Basically, this is going to be produced as a book, an edited volume with a chapter from each. And we're not yet ready to say what we found, except on our own campus. I think that, I mean, the reason for this project, it started out as a project with Helsinki and Southampton, but we did say we would want to extend it. We wanted to compare orientations to English on a mother tongue university. It's sometimes called English dominant university in a mother tongue English country, and in a non-mother tongue English country, which is called an EMI. That would be, strictly speaking, what you'd call EMI university, or a university with EMI programs, or even just EMI courses. But the feeling was that these universities are all calling themselves international, and yet when it comes to language, they have a very, very national position on language. English language is native English. And so I can only speak for the research that we've done here. We've finished our chapter now. We've done all our research and analysed our data and so on. And the feeling was that you look around the university, you go to lectures, we have seminars on Wednesdays, for open seminars for everybody in the department and all the students. And you look around the lecture theatre, and the staff and students, I would say, I actually asked for a show of hands last week because I wanted to make this point, because I was giving the presentation. And I would say over 90%, and possibly well over 90% of people in that room were not mother tongue English speakers. And yet they're all being evaluated against a benchmark of native English. People are different in the whether they tolerate non-native English or whether they don't, and if they tolerate it, whether they still think it's not really right, but if I understand, I'll accept it, sort of thing. But there is this position that it's got to be native, and yet we're international, and it's not being extended to the language. And in our project, I did the linguistic landscaping part. So I went around the campus looking at what was on the walls. And I divided it when I collected all these hundreds of photographs. I divided it into English only, English plus other languages, and other languages only. And I think I looked around a huge number of departments. I think, and right across the university, I found virtually nothing in another language only. I think it might have been one thing in Chinese that was written advertising. I had to get a Chinese speaker to tell me what was in it. It was advertising a rental, some flat for rent or something like that. I found very little in English plus another language, and one of the main things I found had been written by, it turned out, by a PhD student who was in my own department, modern languages, who was looking for people, speakers of Chinese and of Russian.
Right.
And both those posters were written in one in partly in Chinese, one partly in Russian.
I see.
But most of what you saw on the wall was in English only.
Yeah.
And you might get pictures of exotic places, exotic to the native English speakers. But you wouldn't get anything written in the language of that place. And even going around, say, the business school, which has a huge number of non-native speaking students and staff, everything was in English on the walls, all 6 floors. And yet the only people I saw walking around were Chinese, talking to each other in Chinese. So you have a soundscape. I mean, if you go downstairs to the cafe in this building, you'll hear many languages.
Yeah, I did,
and you probably won't hear a lot of English.
Right.
You'll hear many languages, but you look around on the walls, you might see a picture of Seoul or a picture of Tokyo, but it'll be written, the post-it will be in English.
Okay.
You won't see it. You won't see very much that's written in anything else. It is a very monolingual, native outlook as far as language goes.
Yeah.
So this is what the project is looking at, and I can only guess at the moment, but I am guessing that there will be much more flexible use of other languages in the 8 non-mother tongue English universities, and that. And I think especially when Brexit has happened, this is going to exaggerate this situation even more. That because there will then I think be a move towards away from native English, and else will become much less. It will become much more influenced by its multilingual non-native speakers.
Right.
But my guess is that multilingualism is much more prevalent and accepted on campuses that are not in the UK. I suspect Australia will be a bit better than the UK. They have been much more positive about multilingualism than the UK has.
Yeah.
But I don't know, and I would imagine if we'd included the US it would be even worse. And actually even worse than it was now with the current insular way it's now being governed.
Yeah, I look forward to reading that study. Okay, so perhaps we'll end it there. But thank you for speaking to me today. It's been very interesting. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening today. We hope you enjoyed the interview. We'd like to say a big thank you to Professor Jennifer Jenkins for her time. If you'd like to get in contact with us, please send us an email at teflology@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter @teflology. Visit our website teflology-podcast.com and like us on Facebook. You can also rate and review us on iTunes. And don't forget, if you enjoy our podcast, please tell a friend or tell your colleagues about our show. We'll be back again soon.